it became like a gathering spot for all of the graduate students we knew. So instead of going out to the bars or going to the restaurants or whatever, people would just come over, and we did really nerdy graduate school things like drink beers and play board games.
Welcome to the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast, Higher Education in Personal Finance. I'm your host, Emily Roberts. This is Season 3, Episode 3, and today my guest is Dr. Matt Hotze, an Administrative Director at Rice University and co-host of the Helium podcast. Matt bought a home at the start of his PhD program at Duke and rented rooms to his grad student peers. Being a landlord defrayed nearly all of his housing costs throughout grad school and provided him with passive income during his postdoc. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses. Matt shares the challenges of being a landlord who is friends with his tenants and what spurred him to ultimately sell the property. He concludes with excellent step-by-step advice for any other early career PhD considering buying a home for this purpose. Without further ado, here's my interview with Dr. Matt Hotze. I have joining me on the podcast today, Dr. Matt Hotze, and he is going to tell us about his experience owning a home during graduate school and actually renting it out to other people and the effect that that had on his finances. So, Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. And will you just tell us a little bit about yourself, like a brief bio?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be on the show. Really appreciate it. My quick bio is, I went to graduate school for environmental engineering. I started that process actually at Rice University, and then my advisor moved from Rice to Duke University during the middle of my PhD. So that's actually when I purchased a home in Durham, and then went on to do a postdoc. I did a postdoc in France at a place called Surege, where you could probably link to that in the show notes. It's too difficult to explain in French. And then also did a postdoc at Carnegie Mellon, and then eventually landed in publishing. So I worked for the American Chemical Society as a managing editor for 4 of the journals. When I eventually left that job, I was with 4 of the journals as a managing editor and kind of learned the business side of science. And now I work with an engineering research center at Rice University with about 80% of my time. And then 20% of my time I work on Team Helium, which is, we have a podcast called Team Helium, or called Helium Podcast. And I think we'll get into that a little later.
Yeah, that sounds really good. Listeners, you may not believe this, but this is the first I'm hearing that Matt was at Duke, which I was also at Duke. So we have this connection that I did not even expect. So what years were you living in Durham?
I was living in Durham from about 2005. This is rounded off, of course, but to 2008.
Okay, yeah. So I started at Duke in fall 2008. So we may have overlapped a little bit, or maybe we just missed each other.
Yeah.
But
did you camp out for basketball tickets?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so we were probably, I think I did that in the last year for sure. So.
Oh, well, I didn't do it my first year.
Okay,
so,
well, then we didn't overlap on that.
Yeah. Duke has a super interesting basketball culture for those of you who aren't familiar. Very exciting, but we won't get into that. Okay, so very good that you were in Durham. I'm really glad to learn that. Now I personally have much more context about this story about being a homeowner. So tell us how you managed to buy a house during grad school. No mean feat at the start.
Yeah, no mean feat for sure. First of all, I'm blessed because I didn't carry any debt from undergraduate. So my undergraduate didn't have any debt associated with it. So I had that going for me. The second thing I had going for me was when I started graduate school as a PhD, I was in Houston, which is actually my hometown. So I was living with my parents for a better part of a year. And banking, I mean, it's not a huge amount of money, but when you think about it, you're just cutting out your entire, housing expense and all the things that are associated with that. And also turns out living with your parents is really a lot cheaper because you're not driving into town. They live kind of in the suburbs. So you're not driving to town, having beers with your friends, and then, going out to dinner and all these other things. So I was actually able to save a good amount of money in my first year in graduate school while I was getting it was engineering. So I was getting a stipend. It wasn't huge, but it was a decent amount of money for the time.
I want to ask you a little bit of a follow-up there. So you said that you moved from Rice to Duke because your advisor moved, right? Mm-hmm. So you didn't know going into that first year that was going to happen. Presumably, maybe you wouldn't have chosen that advisor. So
he's still at Duke, so no, I like him. He's great.
Nothing against the advisor, just that's a difficult personal thing to go through.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. So what were you saving that money for? Like, what was the motivation behind it? Since you ultimately, it sounds like you could use it to buy this house, but you didn't know that going into it.
I grew up with a mentality like my parents, maybe it was nature, maybe it was nurture, but I'm not the kind of person to just save everything. But I think at the time I was just like, you know what, I can save this money, so why not? And I know, I'm young. I know there'll be a good use for this. So it wasn't as if I was thinking about, like you said, it wasn't as if I was planning this all along, but it was just more like, well, I think if a good situation had come along, like if a fellow graduate student had said, oh, we can live near campus and this and that and the other thing, I might have made that jump and then stopped, receiving those savings. But my personal situation was just so comfortable that it didn't seem like a big sacrifice to be saving that money, because I'm just like, and then thinking about it, I, as a 22-year-old or whatever, 22, 23, I wasn't, I didn't have like this long-term dream for that money, and maybe I should have, but it's just like, well, let's bank this for now and it'll come in handy.
Yeah, and apparently it did. Yeah. So tell us about that. You show up in Durham, you're enrolled in Duke, and you're flush with cash. How did it work?
Well, I mean, you could go back in the real estate records for Durham, and you can see around that time, probably 2005, 2006, the houses there were not that expensive. I mean, in the grand scheme of things. And actually, you can, if we'll get into this later, but obviously the prices in Durham have, and in many other places, have gone up quite a bit, because at the time, I mean, I think that was a .com bubble burst in like 2001, and then there was or 2000, whatever it was, and then there was the downturn, the mortgage downturn, and the Great Recession was kind of coming up, and so the Durham really, one part of the thing is like, it wasn't really my plan, but then when I was looking at the apartments there at the time, they had built a couple really nice ones, but the rent in those apartments was quite expensive, and I was just thinking to myself, well, I think I can get a better deal here. So I had enough money for a down payment, a 20% down payment. I did have to get my parents to co-sign, which involved a ton of signatures, because I had to get their power of attorney. So I had to sign for them and me as I was signing. So it was just a lot of paperwork. But ultimately, I think it was a good decision to go ahead and get a house, because I was able to get something very modest but had 3 bedrooms and rent it to other graduate students for cheaper than what they would be paying otherwise.
Yeah. Do you mind sharing with us the purchase price for the home, or approximate purchase price?
So the approximate purchase house price was around $200,000.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. And why, this maybe is more than you want to say, but why was it necessary for your parents to co-sign? I just asked that because, was it like your length of job history? Oh, okay. It was the income.
So they did not, it wasn't the credit score, because I had a credit score. It wasn't anything else that had popped up, but it's just, the lender did not feel comfortable with the graduate student stipend income covering the. Even though I could tell them, hey, I'm going to rent 2 of these bedrooms out, they didn't care. They were like, we need to know that you can pay this. So that's why my parents end up being on the hook for the other part, just in case I couldn't come to the table with the money.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I mean, a 3-bedroom place is really not affordable on one grad student stipend. And with no history of renting out properties or anything like that, I can definitely see why banks would be skittish, even though you have that 20% down, which is amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's how you got into the house. And was that right when you arrived in Durham, or did you rent for a little while? Okay, so it was basically you sort of set this up even before you moved there.
Absolutely. I thought if I'm going to do this, I'm going to take the plunge right away, because I think it was a time clock thing too, because it's like after a certain amount of time, it wasn't really going to make any sense, because you're paying to all those fees that you have to even get the house in the first place, to buy it, and I forget the name of the fees, but basically there was a certain amount of time I would have needed. So I'm like, either I'm going to do this right when I move there, or I'm not going to do this at all, basically. So
yeah, I remember I sort of got caught in that line of thinking as well. Like, again, living in Durham, even a few years later, it would have been possible for me to buy at some point, maybe a couple years into grad school. But I kept thinking like, well, I've already been here a couple years. I don't really know how long I have left. 3 years, 4 years. Is that really enough time to make it worthwhile, as you were saying, to overcome all the transaction costs of buying and selling a home? I went the other way. I went safe and didn't buy because I thought there wasn't enough time. And then, you know what? For those of you still in graduate school, sometimes grad school takes longer than you think it's going to. Sometimes you hang around in your city that you went to grad school in for longer than you planned on. So in retrospect, I'm like, oh, we had plenty of time. Of course, the market did well, but you don't know those things, right? Going into it. It's kind of a risky decision, but that's why I'm glad to learn from you, since you went the other way from what I did. So, okay, you purchased the house, you know you're going to be there at least a few years until you finish your PhD. So what were, and you chose to be a landlord, as you said, you were renting out the other 2 bedrooms. What were the pros of that decision for another grad student or postdoc, anyone who's thinking of going into that situation where they're a landlord, but they're living with their tenants? What were the pros?
Yeah. Pros, I had, again, almost zero living expenses in terms of like lodging, right? So because the rents from the 2 places, or from the 2 bedrooms, basically covered my mortgage each month. That was huge, right? So I was actually taking the money that I had saved, and then it was benefiting me on a month-to-month basis, because I was never really being squeezed on cash, because I had 2 people that I knew were in graduate school. They're not moving anywhere, right? Unless, we can get into the cons, but that was a pro. The other pro was similar to what I said for living at my parents' house. It became like a gathering spot for all of the graduate students we knew. So instead of going out to the bars or going to the restaurants or whatever, people would just come over, and we did really nerdy graduate school things like drink beers and play board games. So, and we did that all the time, like without, every weekend. And so that is incredibly cheap compared to going out. And we did go out sometimes, but most of the time we were hanging around the house, and that saved me a lot of money too. So those were huge pros in terms of the purchase part of it.
It's really great for me to hear that you, it sounds like we're friends with your tenants. They were in your program. Yeah. You got along. You hung out together. You were social. And I also had the same experience in graduate school of maybe more at the beginning, going out quite a bit, getting to know people, but eventually kind of settling down with our friend groups and just hanging out at each other's homes and playing board games, as you said, and watching Duke games, and just having really like low cost, like high quality social time. So I think it's really, it's weird because it's something that you don't necessarily think about when you're choosing a graduate school and you're trying to even if you are trying to evaluate what are the costs going to be, that living in a city like New York, where people typically go out, it's not typical to meet and hang out in each other's homes because the homes are small and because it's
Yeah.
a very exciting, culture to do that in. It's just very different when you live in a town like Durham. So your entertainment expenses, your going out expenses can be quite different just depending on the type of city that you live in. So that's great to hear. So those are the pros. This summer, I'm putting forth extra support for PhDs undergoing career transitions into grad school, a postdoc, or a real job. If you're moving on to the next stage in your career or thinking about it, please visit pforphds.com/next to check out my articles, webinars, and coaching program. Allow me to come alongside you during this transition to ensure that you set yourself up for financial success. And what were the cons? What were the downsides to living with your tenants?
I was friends with my tenants. No, that's true, actually. So some of them are just fine, right? Some of them were just fine. They're always paid their rent on time and didn't have an issue. How would I put this? So one of the good things about I should actually back up in the story. One of the other reasons why I made the choice to like do it right when we moved there, because I knew I had ready tenants. Like I talked to people and I said, "Hey, would you be interested in having this kind of a situation?" They were like, "Sure, that's great. I don't even have to do anything." It's like we just sign the rental agreement right here and we're good. And so that was very helpful because I didn't even have to go out and search for tenants because I had them built in from our lab group. I think when things kind of got a little hairy, where it was when I mentioned in the intro that I went off to a postdoc and I kept the house, and there were people still living there. They were still paying me rent. I was still managing it, which wasn't really a problem, except for there were the people that were my friends that I knew just a little less. So it started to be the case where they would be like, "Oh, I can't do the rent this month. How about I pay you double next month?" I mean, this only happened a couple of times, but it becomes a little bit stressing because they're in the same friend group as you, and you gotta be able to manage that carefully because you don't want to just like say, "No, I can't." You can't just be like a typical landlord where you can be a very sort of professional about it and be like, "All right, well, you have 7 days and here's what the contract says," and all this other stuff. There are sort of larger social implications to having someone that's not paying their rent. It only happened a couple of times. It all kind of ended up working out in the end, but it was a bit stressful when I was doing that from afar because I was thinking, I mean, obviously had reserves to pay the mortgage, but at the same time, it's never good when you have someone just basically say they can't pay you the rent each month. So
Yeah, and you don't know at the start of that if it's going to be a pattern. Like, sure, you can grant someone it's a one-time thing, no big deal, pay me a week late, whatever it is. But you don't know if that's a slippery slope to you're never getting paid again, ever. And being generous at the beginning can keep a good tenant in place, or you just don't know. You don't know which way it's going to go.
And then if you have multiple tenants, right? If at that time there were 3, right? So it was a great deal for me, right? Because now I'm renting 3 rooms, not 2. But at the same time, then what are the other ones thinking? Well, I can just not pay my rent for a couple months and it'll be fine. And so you're thinking to yourself, okay, I want to treat everyone fairly and equitably, and that's really hard to do sometimes.
Yeah, that's a good insight. It sounds like, I mean, one good thing is that you mentioned there in passing, you had a rental agreement in place. Mm-hmm. That is not something that you might think about if you are a grad student who owns, his own home and you're just renting to your friends, whatever. Like, it's so important to have those legal protections in place for both parties, really.
Absolutely. And just to get things written down, like it's half of it isn't even about the legal part. It's just about having something written down that both people can see and reference. That helps so much with communication.
Yeah, totally agree. I'm glad you did that. So you've already mentioned that Well, okay. I want to ask sort of one side question here about, so you left to this postdoc in France. Um, why did you decide to keep the property at that transition point?
Because I looked at the numbers and I was like, well, if I can rent this other bedroom for the same price, the numbers just made so much sense. And at the time, I didn't have the bandwidth to try to go through the selling process. I also had I had a couple of renters that I knew had a couple more years left on graduate school. So I said, well, I'm not going to have a vacancy here, or at least I didn't think I did. And, and I didn't. But there, it was just like, it didn't seem like a difficult decision to say, well, I could just keep this, keep paying the mortgage, and then and now I'm getting almost like return on the investment in terms of the cash flow from a month to month basis. So it didn't seem like it didn't seem like a difficult decision at the time.
And how was the process of managing the property from afar?
I think most of the disasters happened when I lived there, so we didn't even. That was part of the cons that we kind of skipped over. But
Yeah, go ahead.
we
What
can
were
go
the
back to that.
disasters? Yeah.
But when I was gone, fortunately, one of my best friends from graduate school was one of my renters, so he was just taking care of stuff and not even really asking me for anything. So it that really helped. I mean, I didn't have to get a management company or anything else to help me on that, which would add additional expenses to the rental process. Of course, like 10% typically is what the rental company takes every month, depending on what state you're in. But the point, I guess, going back to the cons, there was a couple of things that happened. It's sort of typical homeowners things. Like, we moved in, the inspector didn't catch some what's called flashing near the chimney, where it wasn't quite sealed correctly, and then it turned out with like kind of the first big storm, there was water leaking, and then so that was just there definitely needed to be some cash in reserve. Like, I couldn't have spent all my cash on the house because those kinds of things would pop up. So that's a roof repair. I think it costs like $500. And it's not something really you can do by yourself, because they're like up there with tar and all kinds of, that is not a do-it-yourself thing unless you're really super handy, and I am not. Our water heater just exploded, but fortunately it was in Durham. A lot of the houses have them in their crawl space, so it was just a flooded crawl space. Didn't really cause any other issues, but that was a couple years in, so I'd already kind of established the house and had some cash flow, so didn't cause a huge issue, but still had to buy a new water heater. Those kinds of things are going to happen. They're inevitably going to happen, and they should be built into a calculation of what you're anticipating, how all the numbers are going to work out in the long run, because the water heater lasts maybe 10, 12 years, especially like a traditional kind. Now they're more of I'm going too deep in the rabbit hole, but now they're more of the small boxes, but the older ones are like those big tubes with the insulation around them, and when they explode, it's very dramatic. The water shooting out everywhere. So that was a con for sure, but nothing too terrible.
So the rule of thumb that I've heard is you can expect to pay on average 1% of the home's value in maintenance and repairs on average per year.
That's pretty good.
I mean, it's a rule of thumb, right? So, so that's something to keep in mind for anyone who's planning on becoming a homeowner in general, even if you're not becoming a landlord or whatever. But the thing is that it's not guaranteed that that average is going to be nice and steady 1% every single year, right? You might have a year when it's 3% or 5%. If something really big happens, and then you'll have a few years when things are smooth sailing and nothing's really going wrong. So this does lead into where I was going with the next question, which is like, what was the overall effect that being a homeowner and a landlord, what effect that have on your finances? It sounds like you were still banking, right? As you're a natural saver, naturally sort of living a low spending lifestyle. So you're able to do things like take care of these repairs and everything as necessary. What was the overall effect on your finances of being able to have close to zero housing costs?
I think, at the end of, I don't know how other people do it because I've never experienced that, but at the end of graduate school, I had not a ton of money saved up, but I mean, I was, I was able to save well, and even after the postdoc, like I had saved up money from that as well. And so I think that just set me up to be successful in in some of the next stages of my life. Like I said, I moved to Pittsburgh at one point for a postdoc, so I didn't buy anything there rented. But Pittsburgh is also a very cheap place to live, or it was when I moved there. I think it's getting a little more expensive, like a lot of places. But it was nice because my wife is also a saver. So when we finally got married, it was nice when we combined all our finances, I wasn't the dunce. So we had set ourselves up nicely with kind of a nest egg to start with. And we didn't ever have to worry about like debt and other things like that, which was great, except for like the mortgage debt. But that was, part of that was kind of taken care of in terms of the calculations of how things were coming in.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. And really, this all comes from the germ of being able to live with your parents after college and also not having debt from college. So yeah, just that's the thing is that fortunately and unfortunately, having some good fortune with your finances early on can snowball into much, much greater fortune, literally over time. And the reverse can be true. Having, poor circumstances near the beginning of your financial life can be exacerbated over time. That's not to say that either one can't be reversed, because they both can, but it sort of has, there's some momentum behind you in one direction or the other. So it sounds like you had that good fortune and you didn't blow it and you made good decisions. So when did you eventually decide to sell this house? How did you make that decision? Was it when your friends, ended up finishing?
Yeah. So that was basically around the time I was in Pittsburgh. And my friends were finishing up and moving out, and I needed to make a decision about whether or not I wanted to be a landlord from afar with people that I didn't know at all. And that's when things got kind of tough. And I didn't have a good knowledge of how to operate a rental property without just knowing the people. And I just, at the time I was in a postdoc, it's pretty intense, trying to get a faculty position. And it just I didn't have the bandwidth to be like, oh, let me think, okay, so maybe I can hire this management company. Maybe I can do this. Maybe I can do that. So when my friends moved out, I was like, okay, let's just sell it. Let's be done with it. Let's move on. Unfortunately, that selling process took a little bit longer than I anticipated it taking. So that was a little difficult, because then you're starting to pay the renters are gone, and you're starting to pay the mortgage without anybody in it, which that becomes painful. Although usually there's less maintenance. Because there's not wear and tear and other things. Of course, the water heater could go at any time, but people could, if people are using it or not. But yeah, that's the idea. It was just people. I felt like it was almost like a trust issue. Like I lived in the house, and I really wanted someone I could trust that was living there at the time. That was my mentality. And if I couldn't get someone I could trust, and I remember having this conversation with my wife. We were just gonna sell the house. So,
yeah, it makes sense to me, because even though there are some stressors associated with living with your tenants, it really makes the process so much easier. Like, there's so much vetting that has to go on when you're taking in, tenants that you don't know, and there's a lot of risk. And so I can just see that it would mentally weigh on you. It would on me anyway, a lot more to be renting to people that I had no knowledge of and no personal relationship with. And, sometimes it's not about the numbers, right? Sometimes it's about how you feel, right? About the numbers and about the money. And so, okay, it's not worth it to you to be a long distance landlord to people you don't know. And great, you got out of the situation and you moved on, and you still have all the wonderful benefits that you enjoyed for the years that you did own. I'm just curious, what year did you end up selling?
That was in 2009, I believe, is when it finally sold.
Okay,
So,
so
so
pretty bad timing,
yeah, pretty bad
economy
timing. Yeah,
wise.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But still, were you like even with the economic downturn that happened with particularly in the housing market, were
Hmm.
you still happy like to that you made that decision for those particular years that you did? Of course, it would have been nice if it had gone another way,
Yeah,
but it was still a good decision, it
yeah.
sounds like.
I basically sold it for the exact price that I bought it for, or maybe just a little bit more. So there wasn't like a huge appreciation or anything, but just in terms of the way that the benefits that I had received over the course of the time that I owned the place were certainly much greater than anything greater than the cost of buying it and all these other things. I never actually went through and did a final calculation of where I stood on things, but I know that it was ultimately a good decision for me, even if it didn't, even if the house didn't appreciate at all because of the current because of the housing situation and the mortgage crisis and all that other stuff that messed things up.
Yeah, but I mean, really what you're comparing to is years and years of renting,
Hmm.
right? Like, so it's like, okay, you didn't make any money on the house, but you
Hmm.
essentially defrayed all of your housing costs, which
Hmm.
would have been huge, like for
Yeah.
those number of years. So yeah, I don't blame you for not wanting to look too deeply into numbers because it is a little bit disappointing,
Yeah.
to sell at that particular time. But
Yeah.
again, for you, it wasn't really about the numbers.
Yeah.
It was about having a good situation while you were there and getting out of it when it was too stressful again. So, yeah,
Exactly.
sounds good. What concluding remarks, like what advice do you have for someone in grad school or maybe a postdoc who knows, well, I'm only going to be living in the city for a limited amount of time. Should I go this route of buying a place and renting out to my roommates? Is that,
Hmm.
yeah, what's your advice for that person?
I would say there's, and I remember this now, is that there's calculators you can get online. I don't have one ready to quote here, but there's probably plenty of them that you can search, or maybe you can link to one on your show notes. But you could actually put in the number of years and put in how much it's going to cost to all the fees and stuff that it's going to cost to get the place in the first place. You can put in your rental numbers, all that other stuff. A lot of these calculators are free, and you can really, and this is one of the things I did that I didn't mention, is you can really see after how many years this is going to play out for you. And so that's the first place I would start, right? And so if it doesn't make sense from a numbers standpoint, I wouldn't do it. And then I think the second thing I would check is saying, am I going to be okay with having uncomfortable conversations? Right. That's the second thing, because that's going to come up. Right. People are going to not pay their rent. People are going to come up with an excuse, or they'll do something stupid, or they'll break things right in the house, and you'll just be like slapping your head, but you're just going to have to let that roll off. Like, it's just going to, those kinds of things are going to happen with a renter you know or a renter you don't know. So the third thing is the repairs. So if you're not comfortable with making basic repairs by yourself, which can get expensive if you're not, if you're sort of ordering out for those all the time, and also if you're not comfortable with talking to people that can make major repairs, and like talking to like basically like vendors who in negotiating prices with them, that is not something you should, that's also something you should not explore, right? Because we talked about this, right? There will be things that come up. And one of the things I forgot to mention is we had a tree in the backyard that died, right? And I was afraid it was going to fall in the house. So I had to call up all these different tree removal companies, and figure out, okay, what's the best price? And you're negotiating with these guys that just drive around in their trucks and have, chainsaws and ropes, so you got to be comfortable, or at least in Durham, right? You got to be comfortable with those kinds of interactions. And if you're not, then I would make sure you check off those three boxes. Those are probably the minimum. And then just see how you feel about it, right? What's your gut feeling about owning rather than renting? And then I think you'll make a good decision.
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice. Very actionable. One, two, three, go down the list. Yeah, great. So I hope this is good food for thought for anyone just starting in a position or about to move somewhere and thinking, hey, this rental market, it doesn't look too awesome, but the buyer's market, the housing market is maybe manageable for me. So yeah, that's really, really great advice. So before we sign off, will you please tell us a little bit more about your podcast?
Yes. So we have a podcast, my co-host Christine and I. It's called Helium Podcast. We can be found at teamhelium.co. And we actually help early career researchers. That's people, senior graduate students, postdocs, early faculty members. We help you navigate through the transition from being a postdoc or early or late graduate student into your first faculty position. So landing that first faculty position, then mastering that first faculty position, and then starting to lead larger groups and teams in science efforts. And that's really what my co-host Christine focuses on. That whole career transition, we exist to help early career researchers through those three transitions. And we bring people on our show that we believe will help those researchers. So if anybody's in the audience, would love to have you come on over and listen to some of our episodes. So we've got a new one coming out every other Tuesday. So
yeah, it sounds fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today, Matt.
Yes, thank you for having me. This is fun. I hadn't thought about that house and all those numbers in a while, so it was kind of good to revisit, I guess, prudent decisions.
Listeners, I'm so glad you joined us for today's episode. pfforphds.com/podcast is the hub for the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast. There, you can find links to all the episode show notes, a form to volunteer to be interviewed, a survey, and a way to join the mailing list. I'd love for you to check it out and get more involved. See you in the next episode. The music is Stages of Awakening by Poddington Bear from the Free Music Archive and is shared under CC by NC. Podcast editing and show notes creation by Jewel Lips.